Good morning, everyone. Let's get seated. I know it was a late night last night, and many of you are wondering whether singing abilities are correlated to risk management understanding and capabilities. I think many of us would like to think so. But thanks everyone for participating in a long day yesterday. It was a great day for MetricStream, and look forward to today. So I'm Brenda Boultwood, and I'm a Senior Vice President with MetricStream, part of our leadership team, and work with our large customers globally. I, before joining MetricStream, was a customer when I was the Chief Risk Officer of Constellation Energy, and after the financial crisis, we're looking at the board's request for a better way of bringing two things. One was, a consistent language about the risks we were facing and how those risks were rated. The board was just fed up with IT saying this was the biggest issue, audit said something else was the biggest issue, risk said something else. And it may have been they were related, but we used different languages, and the board really got whiplash trying to figure out what we were trying to say and interpret it, right? So can we get on a common language? Can we agree if it's red in IT, it's red in audit, it's red in risk management? And then the other thing was after the financial crisis, the company was downsizing. So we had to look to streamline our kind of corporate infrastructure costs, right? And when every silo was operating with its own systems and infrastructure to support its risk reporting, it got expensive, not just in terms of the maintenance and licensing fees, but all the people required for support. So we saw significant reductions as we introduced, a single GRC platform. And yeah, that was MetricStream at the time. Before that, though, I was at JP Morgan, where I headed up risk management in one of the lines of business and led a business called Global Derivative Services. Before that, I headed up market risk, counterparty credit, and operational risk at Bank One. And then, other risk jobs before that. So 25 years really in risk and compliance. But where did the time go? So, when I started doing risk management, it was a little bit after this film was released. But what's interesting is to be standing here today talking about enterprise risk management. And, when I started my career, all banks really did, financial institutions, was manage credit risk. Right? Market risk was new. The idea that you could look at transactions, you could aggregate them at a portfolio level, and then you could have summary metrics like value at risk or deltas and gammas and betas and thetas to measure rates of change in those portfolios, right? And sensitivities to different variables. But things have evolved, and regulators have also gotten more proactive in risk management, and so we've seen more guidance around not just market and credit risk, but also operational risk. And where is all this going? So we're going to call this kind of the return of ERM, and it's going to be in a slightly new form. And it's going to extend beyond its current scope, or its old scope, really, its past scope. And what's different today, and this is going to be my punchline at the end of the presentation, because we're going to talk about the fact that a lot has changed since the 80s, right? And today we can say confidently that the technology exists, right, to integrate risks across qualitative and quantitative risk measures, right? The technology exists, platforms are scalable, they can be managed to get to the performance levels that you're looking for. I think very importantly, the data model exists. We can manage these risks, but we can relate the output of our risk management efforts through a data model. And then, we're seeing increasingly across companies that performance incentives are being aligned with our ability to execute, right, along this line of enterprise risk management or extended ERM. And then, importantly, the idea is maybe we can get something out of this, right? So we can scale and scope, we can create a flexible data model, we can identify risk data through our taxonomies, and we can mine our risk data. So, we're getting to the point now, and you've heard it in the discussions on Monday and Tuesday, where we're thinking about artificial intelligence, we're thinking about predictive analytics, and it's not just an idea, we're actually implementing and executing at many places this idea so that we can build not just reporting in a silo of operational risk or third-party risk management or audit or market risk or credit risk, but across these risk disciplines, applying these new types of analytic techniques. And what are companies looking for? Talking to one major bank in New York, they've just set up a new enterprise risk management program. It was kind of a reprise from something they were doing before the year 2003. But what's different today is they're looking to bring these different sources of risk information together, apply advanced analytics so that, if the idea of a blue van is mentioned in one risk assessment and it pops up in another risk assessment, it pops up in an issue, they can then have the machine bring that intelligence together to try to find something that may be emerging that no one in their silos might necessarily recognize. But when you're bringing this data together across the qualitative and quantitative risk information, you're able to detect new information and ways of viewing what's important to the company overall. So very exciting stuff. And it's not just one or two companies. We're really seeing, kind of a pickup of these enterprise risk management ideas. And, what's different? Well, we have to extend the scope of risk management because the business model's changing. And we heard yesterday a panel of board members talk about, when they're asked the question, what's the most important risk you face? Is it cybersecurity? Is it, your operation and execution risks? Is it your credit risk? He said, well, it's all of it. Right? It's coming from all directions at us, right? And so we've got to be aware that, we're going beyond traditional products. We talked yesterday about how consumer behavior, buying patterns are changing, how we interact with customers, more and more digital, right? We have shorter customer attention spans. Gunjan Sinha talked about how we need it now. Right? We need that information now. We need to feel that accomplishment of that transaction. And so all of this has led to not necessarily new risks, but the need to look at these risks together. We can't necessarily look at cybersecurity risks and say, oh, I feel comfortable with all our mitigation plans because you know what? That next strategic risk, as Chris McLean was talking about from Forrester, we may just spend 5% of our time discussing those strategic risks, but when we have risk events and we attribute it to a type of risk, it's the risk that's costing us overall about 80%, 85% of, kind of the total cost of risk incidents across our company. So in summary, it's not about necessarily, that the Jedi is back, right? But because we have this unique situation where we have all of these risks coming together, and now we have the technology, we have the data model, we have the enablers. So you say, what could go wrong, right? If we're headed in this direction, what could be the obstacles? You know what? And it's the soft stuff we're seeing, right? It's the ability to bring the collaboration, from across the silos, and it's the ability to execute large programs. But we know from our discussions yesterday and on Monday that many companies are getting through these challenges, right? Setting up very successful program management capabilities and, bringing together this information. So the scale of enterprise risk management is growing, and, not to talk too much about history again, but, it used to be that we were talking about impact and likelihood. We learned that from our market risk risk days, right? We applied that to market and credit risk. We now apply it to our risk factors as we try to understand the relative importance of our inherent risks, right, across the qualitative information that we're looking at. But now we're confronted with also the velocity of change, which we say is happening quickly. And as we just highlighted, the interrelationships between these risk types, and the fact that, getting your arms around cybersecurity risk is not adequate because you have the next strategic risk coming at you from the side, right? So what this is about is that large financial institutions, large companies globally, we've set up very mature risk management functions, but they typically exist in silos, right? So we still have our market risk, our credit risk, our operational risk, our third-party risks, our BCM, our compliance risk assessments, our legal and general counsel risk assessments, dealing with third parties. But we really are still talking about the need to bring this integration together. Okay, so that has been the essence of a governance, risk, and compliance program, right? But in governance, risk, and compliance, we've really been focused on those qualitative risk management capabilities, right? What we learned from market and credit, and bringing qualitative capabilities to, the softer risk management functions like operational risk or third-party risk. But the lack of information in an integrated sense is leading to regulatory challenges, right? And many of you are aware of some new Basel guidance that came out in the form of BCBS 239, right? And so this need for an integrated data model meant all of you guys are here, you get it, you're part of the solution. But regulators still felt that we weren't moving fast enough, and we needed to ensure we had complete data models, right? That these data models were accurate. So we have data quality oversight, right? And then also we have the ability to adapt these data models through change controls over time, right? So here again, we're talking about our organization structure, our risk taxonomy, our control library, and that adaptation, the management of the relationships between these data objects, it's got to be timely, and it's got to have data integrity, right? So how many of you here have worked with BCBS 239? Have you heard of it, right? It's a regulatory kind of bulletin that's out there from Basel. The expectation is that there'll be regulators, requiring adoption over time, and different regulators, whether it's the Fed or the OCC or the PRA, are setting their timeline. But for the first time, they're looking underneath the types of risk information we're managing and saying, how is that data model being managed so that we can get to the aggregation of risk information that we need and the reporting, the accurate and timely reporting of that information. So here you have a regulatory requirement all around aggregation and reporting, right, across the risk types. And again, I look at this and I think it's a lot like what's happened in operational risk as the regulators have moved from kind of what we've called, kind of advanced modeling capabilities and allowing different financial institutions to create their own bespoke capital models. They said, oh my goodness, many of you probably have done a great job, but it's very difficult for us to understand how to compare these capital models and how to, determine whether one's better than the other. So they recently changed, from an AMA approach to the standardized measurement approach, SMA, right, which is more prescriptive, and it's driven by a combination of internal information as well as external factors, and is going to be consistent across all the banks that do the reporting. Okay, so this BCBS 239 is something similar, but gets to the underlying data model itself. Okay, So with that as a driver, we can say, oh my goodness, we've got to now think about that data model, but the information in our company is everywhere, right? We have the risk guys, and this isn't just an operational risk now, it's market and credit risk, it's vendor risk management, it's compliance risk management, it's a broader set of third-party risk management, but we're going to bring that information together with a common taxonomy, and we're going to marry it to our business universe, so how we map it to our organization, our processes, our products, our assets, and our functions. And then, we're going to have to link that to what we've created in our compliance world, right, in terms of that inventory of compliance requirements, not just BCBS 239, but the plethora of other requirements that we have, and where we manage areas of compliance, the names of all our regulators, the types of engagements we have, and the change in those things. And then, that third line of defense on the audit side, creating the findings, the auditable entities, and the evidence. So how is all this going to be brought together in an organization structure that's not just, kind of business unit and functional unit, but, we need to manage that information by region and country, and then also by legal entity, right? So, if we focus on the risk universe, we know we've got BCBS 239 now coming down from the regulators, which is all about, that data model, the completeness of that information. But we've also got a risk framework, a risk library, as we've talked about, that, is covering those, kind of the second line of defense. If you look at what's in the blue there, that's operational risk, it's IT risk, it's third-party risk, business continuity risk, compliance risks, right? And we've talked about kind of an integrated second line of defense, right? And our ability to share information, share, the controls, the control environment and the control testing and assessments. But now at the bottom, we've got those quantitative risk measures. So we've got market risk, credit risk, liquidity risk. And then we talked yesterday in some of our panels about the importance of these longer range risk management functions around, what are the strategic risks, or what could really impact the company and our assumptions about our business model in that 3 to 5 year time frame. Okay, so we've got lots of different risks. So we've got a federated risk taxonomy, and we've got this capability or this need now from the regulators in BCBS 239 to be managing the accuracy, completeness, integrity, as well as the adaptation of that data model over time, right, with all of its relationships. Right? Those are that's been the special sauce of GRC, is saying it's not just good enough to manage in silos, but we're going to find the relationships between this risk information as well. And we're going to manage that in a risk control data model, right, that builds off of the types of risk assessments we perform, whether it's a vendor risk assessment, an operational risk assessment based on, kind of a look at a process or a business unit that we're managing, the control tests for those controls related to the risks we're managing, the scenario analysis, the metrics that we're managing, the issues that are being created, not just by audit, but any group performing risk assessments, whether it's compliance or IT or the third-party group. And we're managing incidents, loss events, near misses, right? And relating all that information to each other, and then to that data library, right? That risk taxonomy that we've worked so hard to create, right? So it's all of a sudden, it's starting to look, just even on the risk side, look at that picture, right? It's getting a little complicated over here. But this is, proudly, I think we can say this is what we've developed, right, around qualitative risk management. And now the next step we're taking is, that it's really about integrating across all these risk types, and including the quantitative measures like liquidity risk and market risk, right? But that's just a piece of the story, right? So we have these risks that we're managing. We've got a federated kind of risk taxonomy. We have all the types of information used to glean intelligence from that qualitative type of information around operational risks. But now we've got to relate it back to our organization. Where does this have impact? Which business unit? Which legal entity? We need to be able to slice the data by country, by region, by function, by asset, by product, by process, right? So that we can use that same data model to allow different types of storytelling, right? Different types of analysis across the organization, right? So that it serves multiple needs, right? And so our enterprise risk management landscape now is looking a little like a ball of spaghetti string, but we know we've got a structured risk taxonomy. We know we've got data integrity checks around that data model. And then we've got structured processes for managing all those metrics and performing our risk assessments, managing the scenario analysis, and so on. But we have to add the compliance piece, and then we add the audit piece, right? And this, right, becomes our enterprise risk management framework, extended to include, not just the qualitative risk that we've been managing kind of under the broad operational risk umbrella, but also those third-party risks, the compliance risks, and now the qualitative, and all of this aligned between, kind of an integrated second line of defense in terms of the data model, but also with the third line of defense. But what's been one of the most important topics we've discussed is that all of this serves the first line of defense, right? And becomes the most relevant, a very relevant source of information, in our view, that drives every staff meeting of every business person. What else should they be talking about but their most important risks and issues? What came out of the last risk assessment? What is the scenario analysis saying? But to do that, we've got to have relevant information and quick, right? They want it now. Okay? So now that we have that high quality data, we know the business wants it now, right? Where does it come from, right? Or what do we do next? And all of us, I think we've all sweated through the process of getting to this point. Now, where is it going? Okay? And by the way, I just wanted to say, I'm blinded a little bit by the light here, but we'll be looking for hands, and feel free to ask a question at any time. And I've got some colleagues here with microphones, so I'll be looking out, but would love to hear your questions and thoughts as we go through this. So what's happening next? Oh, okay, so we have this whole phenomenon now of big data, right? It's not just the structured information we've been managing through our risk taxonomies and in performing our risk assessments, but we've got information coming, as we say, from external sources. And this could be structured content coming from professional content providers, groups like, the guys from UCF that are standing next door, trying to bring us a unified controls framework, across NIST, COBIT, ITEL, COSO, and ISO and other standards, right? How can we harmonize that information? We have Dow Jones sending us alerts, about our third parties, right? But also helping us with our OFAC and PEP screening, right? And we have others providing information about changes in regulations, right? But we also have the need to connect into email sources of information, also RSS feeds that may be relevant to the people performing risk assessments or managing information. And so we've got to bring that big data into this equation, right? Through structured business rules or phrases that we're looking for, so we can intelligently direct that information to the people that need it in the second line of defense as they challenge risk assessments, but most importantly to those in the first line of defense, so that they don't get blinded by the organizational walls, right? They are able to look at the broader environment in their industry and their country and bring that information to bear as they're thinking about the risks that are relevant. So this affects, not just operational risk, but also, the ability to manage changing compliance requirements, the ability to adequately onboard and monitor our third parties, right? And then in our audit, the ability for auditors to, see that information, not just from the internal sources that we've structured, but also contextual information coming from outside to better inform, everything from how you plan and scope an audit to how it's executed and which controls are most important for testing. But, basically leveraging this integrated platform to bring us better competitive intelligence. Right? Okay, so it's now we've talked a lot about structured data. We've talked about regulatory requirements, BCBS 239, and the requirements to have, real integrity around that data model and the ability to aggregate and report information. Now we've added big data, right, to this equation and bringing contextual information from external sources, as well as unstructured internal sources like emails or memos and policies, right, that you're operating to. So that information can be relevant to the people, performing risk assessments, overseeing and challenging those risk assessments, and then providing assurance. And so we've been talking about the notion of, collaborating across the lines of defense. But now, we, again, just to repeat, we have the technology, we have the data model, we have the different sources of risk information, whether it's qualitative from more the operational risk management side, or whether it's quantitative and you're measuring liquidity and market risks, right? And now the risk functions, the business groups, the audit functions, they're doing things with this data, right? So the business is using this data to formulate its business strategy, right? Linking to its business objectives. We've talked a lot about risk appetite, setting up a risk tolerance, right, level. And then, working to ensure that we've got kind of a common naming convention across our risk universe, operational compliance, third-party IT, market, credit, and so on. And then we've got the second line of defense actually doing their work. And in operational risk, we call it RCSAs, capturing metrics, capturing risk events, and then doing scenario analysis. And then in third-party management, we've got vendor onboarding, in terms of the risk assessments we're doing. Are they an appropriate third party to bring in? And then the ongoing monitoring. Can we capture their contractual SLAs? Can we monitor those SLAs over time against information that's coming in real time, not just from that company, but relative to their tiered peer group in the third party management space, and then manage the risks and losses that come to us from those third parties. And then the whole compliance element, regulatory, your rules inventory, your changes, and then your compliance risk assessment, and then the ability to map all of your rules to compliance policies, to controls, and to the business units, right, that are subject to them. So a lot going on in this collaborative notion of, integrating across the lines of defense, first, second, and third. But we're seeing this is happening in many organizations and leading to, much more integrated, second line of defense functions and a third line of defense that's able to leverage the information from the first and second line of defense. Okay, so what's an example? How does this look in reality? Well, if you just look at third-party risk management and enterprise risk management, right, or operational risk management, on the right-hand side in the blue, we're managing risk metrics, risk assessments, risk events, loss events, scenario analysis, and then culminating in issues and actions that are managed, right? But in the third-party area, we know that we've got contracts that we're monitoring with third parties, making sure that they're compliant with the rules that we've set out for that relationship. We're performing risk assessments. We're putting together mitigation plans that our third parties are responsible for adhering to. We're doing due diligence and continuous monitoring of that third party through its life in the organization, and we're managing performance, like which third parties are actually doing what they said in their contract and which ones are performing best across the tier of vendors in a certain category or, at a certain spend level, within the company. How can that does it make sense to share that information? Of course it does, right? And so, kind of the natural kind of arrows going back and forth in terms of, incorporating issues that have been identified in the operational risk assessments, related to a business process that third party supports. Right? And when you can do that, you say, well, how else could we really assess risks in a business process, unless we were able to include, the issues and action plans, right, that are being managed by our third-party group and in conjunction with the vendors we use. We're doing that due diligence and monitoring. So any kind of risk event, it needs to not only be known by the third-party team and the vendor, and perhaps priced into the quality, right, that they're providing our company, but also managed as a loss event by the operational risk management team. And then, performing those risk assessments in the operational risk area against a business process or a business unit. But because we now have a data model that ties those third parties and vendors to that business process, able to see the types of third-party risk assessments that have happened so that information can be brought into the overall operational risk assessment. And then looking at contract compliance, we're monitoring SLAs. Many vendors are sending us that metric information, but now lining it up against those third parties, which are lined up against the process, and using those metrics to bring intelligence for our continuous monitoring program to indicate not just the level of residual risk we found in our last quarterly assessment, but how is that risk level changing as the metrics coming in are evolving over time. So questions about this? Because the interesting thing is, this is just one example, but we could lay all the functions against each other, right? So we could, instead of in the top left corner it being third-party risk management, it could be IT risk assessments, right? And then it could also be compliance risk assessments, and it could be compliance versus third parties, or operational risk versus, the compliance risks, and operational risks against the IT risks, right? But we're realizing they're all related, and the information from one area needs to feed the other to get the really holistic view of what's going on, not just from an operational risk perspective, but from a compliance management, a third-party management, and an IT asset risk assessment perspective. Any questions or comments, right? But we're showing this collaboration, based on the output of information. So we have, kind of this notion now that we've created around enterprise risk management, but just to kind of refrain some of the principles we've talked about, Gunjan set them out in his keynote about, this is really all now about the first line of defense and the need to keep everything from the vocabulary we're using to the approach to risk assessment as simple as possible, so that our first line of defense users feel empowered, right, and capable, with some but not enormous amounts of training, to do the type of risk assessment we need, in their function, right? So we're keeping it simple. We're also making it pervasive, so that it may just be once a year in attesting to a policy, or it could be triggered risk assessments based on the continuous monitoring of risk levels against, metric thresholds we've sent to trigger risk assessments. But we're sending those risk assessments closest to where those risks are being taken, triggered on the basis of risk events or metrics that exceed thresholds, perhaps in addition to the scheduled frequency, right? But embedding that risk assessment and making it part of the way our first line of defense does their business, right? And all of that kind of sitting on that integrated data model and the workflow engine, right, that's using business rules to send this information to our people. And then, getting to those predictive insights. So next, we're going to talk about, well, what do we mean by prediction, okay? Any questions or comments? Okay, because again, I'm going to go back. I'm just going to reiterate the theme we started with, which was, that the technology exists to make this happen, right? We know that. That can't be an excuse anymore. And we can make this scalable and perform at the level we need it to. We know that the data model exists. We've heard groups talk about it on stage. You guys are living and breathing it, right? Performance incentives are being aligned, right, to successful execution of these types of programs, right? Increasingly, we're seeing that. And then also, the smart analytics exist. And then the questions will just be, again, do we have the culture, the level of collaboration we need to make this happen, right? And that, in my mind, is all about the leadership that you guys are bringing in your organization, right? And sometimes it's a little bit of leadership, it's a little bit of counseling that you're doing. Perhaps as people have to give up the tools that they once used and join, something that's broader necessarily than the function that they've been operating in historically, okay? So how do we get there, okay? So we've collected this risk data, right? And now what are we gonna do with it, right? So one important thing is just data visualization, right? And being able to have that scalable, high performance platform that's in real time able to bring you the information that is important to your role in the organization, as well as, indicate to you what might be most important in terms of your priorities, right? Is it the risk assessment? Is it the assessment of this new event information? Is it the exceptions that are being created by the metrics that may be exceeding their thresholds? Is it the number of open action plans, right, that need to be closed out, right? So we've got a lot of information, but we're using this visualization to help you prioritize, right, based on risk levels, what's most important, right, as you lead this. So visualization, contextual information, prioritization, what's critical, being brought to you, in dynamic dashboards, right? And then, as we move past the dashboarding and reporting, we can say, we've been pretty good in those dashboards at our descriptive analytics, right? We're kind of taking information, now it's real time, right? I think many of you are in organizations where, that came as a result of, the fact that, to get to real time, you went through your period on spreadsheets where it might have taken weeks, right, to get to aggregated information in a dashboard. But now we're here, we have the insight, we have the descriptive analytics, and where are we going to now move into predictive analysis, and then how can we use this information not just to predict, but to gain foresight, into what could be most important from a strategic risk perspective in terms of risk events that are happening outside your company, to help you make better business decisions and give better advice about what the company needs to be doing, right? So, it's about what has happened, what did happen, what is happening. But, we're going to use this risk information to now ask the questions, what is likely to happen, and then what has to be done, right, to mitigate or potentially prevent that if it's a downside risk, or how do we accelerate it if it's a risk that actually brings opportunity to the company. Right? So we're talking about mitigation and acceleration depending on which side of the risk we're on, right, as a company. Okay? So very exciting developments in the area of natural language processing. Okay, so this, artificial intelligence, natural language processing, it's almost like another return of the Jedi, right? We were talking about artificial intelligence, 10, 15 years ago. I think, and the question really became, what do we apply it to, right? I mean, is it just robots we're going to be creating? Is it really just, super genius Watson machines that can beat human chess players, right? There's got to be more to artificial intelligence than that. Right? And so now we've had a decade or more to think about these kind of data sciences. And now, building on that data model, building on the wealth of qualitative and quantitative information we're bringing together from inside and outside the company, we're saying, we could be, looking at our information and identifying, as we talked about this major bank in North America, talking about how do we recognize similar issues that may be coming out in different functional groups. So, the vendor risk assessment team may have noticed this issue across several of their vendors around, the importance of, I've talked about this phrase, blue van, right? It may be coming out in our risk assessment in one of our business unit, blue van, and it may be part of some new emerging compliance requirement, blue van, right? But can we use the machine to bring that information, recognize that across the different disciplines and in our data model, so that that information can be brought to the attention and into the dashboard of the risk manager, right? So it's a notion that is being applied today, right? We have customers, for example, that are managing incidents across their company, and these incidents may be, in the first line of defense, where in this case the company is managing, airplanes, right, in large airports around the world, right, and all of the logistics of getting supplies to that airplane. Right? Oh my gosh, incidents can happen everywhere. It can happen in the food supply, it can happen in the cleaning, it can happen in the security, it can happen in the plane maintenance, it can happen in, just the personnel managing all these processes, right? So how do they collect information about these incidents, but then use the machine to bring the information, the common themes, recognize phrases, keywords, similarities intelligently. So it may not just be blue van. The guy writing in Spanish is, something about an azul, automobile, right? But the machine recognizing across languages, across functions, where we're seeing something common, right? And bringing that to the attention. And now all of a sudden we have, some type of information that is, possibly able to predict something we may need to look at as a top risk, in the company, because it's emerging as an issue in so many places. Another company using this idea of natural language processing, and even one of our important regulators in the US, collecting information about customer complaints, right? Okay, customer complaints, we're talking potentially thousands of records, right, of information. And as you look at that information, you're not just trying to detect words or phrases that may be the same or similar, but also the sentiment around them. Because some people may be on the telephone complaining, it's my mom and she's complaining, but she's using very nice language, but she's really angry. Right? But then you have another person that may be using expletives and describing the issue they faced, right, from a customer service perspective. But the machine now has to detect that even though someone is being nice, the words they're using, the way those words are being used, they're really quite upset about that issue, right? And then marry that with the guy that's using the expletives as well, right? And so you're seeing something common, even though that issue may be being expressed differently by different people, right? So natural language processing, finding a home in GRC, as we're managing lots of different silos of information and need to bring that insight to the risk manager who's looking to find the trends across the enterprise and the ideas and threats that may be emerging, for this company. Okay, so that's natural language processing. I've given two very simple examples, but I think you can use your imagination to think, now we've got this large, big unstructured data, we've got quantitative information, we've got additional qualitative information. How is that information going to get related to each other? It's through this kind of notion of artificial intelligence that we're bringing to bear, okay? And then also, thinking about another form of kind of artificial intelligence, calling it algorithmic intelligence. And here another use case is a company that's really based its risk management program on metrics. So very much, kind of an extension of kind of an IT risk framework where you're looking at, metrics around the number of production incidents, the number of asset failures, the number of breaches in our data centers, the number of penetrations in our networks, right? But applying that across the different risk types so that we're thinking about, our people risks, our process risks, our third-party risks in the same way and applying those types of metrics and the thresholds for them. But here, going beyond the idea that a metric has gone beyond a threshold and sending an alert, to do another risk assessment or take some action. Here we're saying, we've got a lot of metrics and we really don't know how they're related. But could we propose some leading and lagging types of results so that, for example, we've had a number of control test failures related to reconciliations in our financial accounts, right? And could this be a leading indicator of write-offs that we're making, in those accounts because of inaccuracies in our financial account booking? Well, hopefully that's not happening very often, right? But the idea is, can we take, groups of metrics and then look for correlations? Because we don't really know, is it contemporaneously correlated? Is there a leading period? Is there a lagging period? Let the machine figure that out and bring that information to us and say, wow, these control test failures are leading indicators of the incidents that we're having and most of the loss events that we've incurred. Okay? It's not an outlandish notion, right? It makes a lot of sense. But we're now being able to bring this information together, from the very qualitative practice of testing controls, right? To the idea that we're potentially losing money. And then the idea being, well, don't just sit and watch it happen, right? If we know this correlation exists and we see a series of control test failures, everyone should be on alert that a loss is likely. And so if we want to mitigate, maybe that loss will be acceptable, but if we wanted to mitigate that, what might we do? We might invest in the control environment, right? To prevent those control test failures, right? Or the failures we're seeing. Any thoughts or questions? But this is now in practice, right? And it requires, a slightly more advanced kind of stage in terms of metrics monitoring. But all we're doing is taking metrics from across the enterprise, whether it's third parties we're managing and the SLAs against their contract, or it's the metrics in our operations, or the metrics, the credit risk metrics, the increase in the loss given default, and how that's related to portfolio write-offs, right? So it's kind of looking across these indicators of market credit, operational, third-party compliance, and other types of risks to find, what kind of information is correlated. And then just to make it more interesting, we shouldn't just look at information inside the company. No, from credit risk management, from market risk management, we know that external metrics like changes in interest rates or changes in the default rate for automobile loans, those could be related as well to the losses that we're facing in these portfolios, but also potentially volume issues that we're seeing in our operations, right? That we may be measuring just with metrics, but maybe there are leading indicators coming from the macroeconomic environment, right? So it's bringing metrics from inside the company as well as outside, and then correlating these metrics, but then, using those correlations, of course, then it could augment, what type of stress testing should we do? What type of scenario analysis? How sensitive is our capital to the changes in the variables inside the company and outside? Okay, so another form of artificial intelligence, but, again, letting the machine find these correlations and let the machine become smarter about those rules that suggest the relationship between these variables inside and outside the company. So very exciting work, right? And imagine being able to integrate this into that original dashboard we were talking about. And all of a sudden we've gone from a descriptive environment, assessment to a predictive one. Right? So we are here, folks. We are here. The day has arrived, right? The Jedi is here, okay? And the question is, do we have, kind of the program execution capabilities, the program management, the culture that's going to allow us to share this information and take advantage of it, ultimately to, feed those better business decisions, right? So we've talked today about the return of enterprise risk management with a force, right? A big force, right? And with a lot of support that we didn't have 15, 20 years ago when we were originally talking about enterprise risk management, as we saw, market credit and operational risk emerge, right? And so we were always wondering, how do we integrate this qualitative and quantitative information? And the exciting thing now is we're able to go beyond the scope. We can understand and how we grow and scale in the scope of these data management capabilities. We have a scalable and flexible, adaptable data model. We can identify risk data sources to bring together the taxonomies, and we can mine that risk information to not only describe the environment we're in, but also to predict the types of losses and, most importantly, the types of activities that make most sense given, limited resources within the company, and move away from, ideas around risk assessment just being scheduled to really triggering actions, activities, priorities based on the event information we're seeing in the system. And then, building that reporting structure. So, of course, we have those descriptive dashboards, but also that we're using the machine to intelligently suggest the types of predictions. And when we talk about predictions, we're talking about the types of business advice you're now equipped to provide to that first line of defense user, right? Okay, so questions? Okay, and may the force be with us as we continue on this journey. Some of what we've talked about in terms of, just bringing this information together is aspirational, but just wanted to highlight that, again, just back to the themes, the technology exists, the data model exists, right? The incentives we're seeing at companies are increasingly aligned to getting this done across the first, second, and third line of defense. And now it's just a question, can we execute? And can we bring the culture in our companies that allow that collaboration, right? And see the benefits in terms of the descriptive dashboards and also the predictive analytics that we're gonna do. Okay, so it's exciting times, right? And I'm not sure I ever imagined that, when we were originally talking about ERM, we'd be talking about its return. But, exciting for all of us. So any questions that you have? I know it was a late night, right? And I think, Gunjan, everyone's kind of satisfied with the idea that singing, your singing capabilities may be related to the quality of risk management and your ability to execute this program. So that's fine. We can all rest on those singing laurels. But I'm glad everyone had fun. Any questions or thoughts? Challenge? Can we do it? Can we have more case studies next year at this summit where we talk about this in practice? That's our hope. Okay. Well, thank you very much. You guys have a great day.